Good afternoon, guys, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. It is October 7th, 2019, and today is going to be, this video is going to be sort of a bonus video because in the interest of trying to figure out how to work with OBS, I decided to put together another sort of uh, rambly, talky video where I go over some notes on a particular topic. I also wanted to try out the lighting sources that I got, just a couple of cheap LED lamps, to try to make my office seem a little bit less cave-like. So we're going to see how this goes. And the topic of today's video is going to be on the right wing as it stands in a pronomian paradigm, I guess you could say. So I'm sort of building off of some ideas that Moldbug put out, and that are summarized really well in Dave the Distributist's video on Moldbug, specifically on this concept of pro and antinomianism as they separate the right and the left. I think it's a very helpful way to think about the right wing as being pronomian, as being, of course, so the antecedent of nomen, right, is say law. So a pronomian is someone who is pro-law, and you can think of pronomianism as sort of making order out of chaos. At least that's how I'm choosing to think of it for the purposes of this video. And so, given that there are these two modes of viewing pronomianism, of viewing right-wing politics in general. And so I'm going to talk about the two different modes that I see. And of course, this is just a crackpot theory that I cooked up this morning because I was um, feeling particularly creative or whatever it was. So I jotted down some notes and we're going to go over them. And of course, we're going to get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is city building and architecture, because I think that's a helpful way to think about it. But first, to give sort of an overview of pronomianism and antinomianism. Like I said, I think this is a good way. It's something that's found in Moldbug, and it's a good way to characterize the right-left dichotomy. Um, I think of it as a dichotomy between order, a tendency to order and a tendency to chaos, a tendency to law and a tendency to lawlessness, and a tendency to servium as opposed to non-servium. And so the two modes of pronomianism in this instance are the builders and the preservers, or the reimposers. So I'll talk about each in their turn. The first one I'm going to talk about is the builders. So the builders as a group, they sort of this symbolizes the people who assemble a society from surrounding disorder, whether it's the disorder of the wilderness or of the surrounding societal state of chaos. So builders don't necessarily have to be people who go into a uncultivated frontier and tame it, but they build up institutions and they build up settlements, if you will, from a surrounding state of relative chaos. Relative chaos. They don't completely reject violence, but they're relatively passive as opposed to the preserver or the reimposer mode. And these people, you can think of them as the assemblers of cities, of religions, and of civilizations. And so, as opposed to these people, you can think a little bit about the preservers. This is another strain of pronomian thought, and these people are associated with the end of the project of the builders, and they're sort of a last remnant of a pronomian spirit before a society or a civilization collapses. A way I like to think about how the builders make order out of chaos is in regards to city building. This is because one of the key ways in which human beings impose order on a wilderness, which is in a sense a kind of chaos, is by transforming an area spatially, geographically, and changing its features. And so, if you'll note, the city builders, or the builders of pronomian cities in a sense, um, their fundamental unit of building is a village. The village, rather than the cottage or the fort or the megalopolis, is kind of the defining unit of human civilization. Well, why is this? Well, it's just large enough to have a healthy amount of genetic diversity, but it's just small enough to ensure um, close group cohesion. Villages are human scale structures because they're small enough to traverse on foot. Of course, this is important in an age before automobiles. They're also not arbitrary. They exist where they exist because of a confluence of auspicious factors. So there's relatively flat terrain near a natural resource of some kind. They're accessible generally by water, and they're comfortable places to live in the long term. So you note, say for example, a village that you'll find in the countryside in Europe. Generally, these villages have been built in places where people can live for extended periods of time. So it's not an area that is constantly under threat of severe weather. It's not an area that is constantly being flooded out, so on and so forth. And of course, it's the village that gives rise to the city. And a traditional city is really nothing more than a collection of villages. I think a good example, even though it's not a traditionally planned city, but a good example of how a traditional city might function, or a city within a traditional society might function, is how in New York, in the old times, there were different neighborhoods for different ethnic groups. You had Little Italy, and you had Chinatown, and you had so on and so forth. A neighborhood, in a sense, is an expression of a village mentality. A neighborhood is a small village within a larger city. And so, one of the ways that tradition is expressed is the way in which cities are laid out, a way in which this pronomian understanding of how man shapes the environment is borne out by looking at this. So I want to show a couple of examples. The first of which I want to show is, so this is a overhead map of Paris from I think the 18th century. And so you'll notice in the street patterns there are interconnected webs of streets that all join up with each other, and they curve and naturally flow, and they naturally section off the city in a certain way. And so many old cities are like this. Generally, the way that these cities are built is that they have radiating and web-like road structures as opposed to a grid. And this is a reflection of the fact that a traditional understanding of space under the right of the builders centers the village around a central focal point. So it's usually a temple or a church. So the way in which the space is configured represents that hierarchical understanding. So, think of it like this: the space horizontally, or the space across the ground, is a representation, in a sense, of the hierarchy of the chain of being, which is a very pronomian idea, you might say. So in the modern era, city builders realized that grids and automobiles were destroying a human way of relating to space within the cityscape. That's why, for example, you see a lot of cul-de-sacs. So I'll give you an example. This is the classic example of a city that is built on a grid pattern, is New York. And the thing about New York, of course, is it's not really a human scale city. It's one of the first cities that was planned out this way, planned out in a grid. And even though, New Yorkers, to their credit, and people generally will be able to take a space that is not designed with people in mind, I would say, as I don't think New York City was, and be able to force it into a more amenable, a sort of more humane. Think of it like human beings sort of colonize this space. Because if you've ever been to New York, you know that it's a very vibrant city, and people take a lot of pride in it. It's grown into a very human place. But this style of city building has led to a lot of cities that don't have any character, uh, because they break down this um, sort of idea that the builders have, where they build up from these small units, these villages, and they build them up and prop them up together into something that is organic. So a good example of this, I would say, is Las Vegas. So if you look at this overhead map of Las Vegas, there's a couple things about Las Vegas that make it a particularly antinomian built city, I would say. So first of all, it's in the middle of the desert. It's a very bad place to build a city. There's no water. Lots of Las Vegas's water, for example, I believe is piped in from the Navajo reservation. And furthermore, if you'll notice, so it's more or less a grid pattern, but it has these big long streets in it, right? And these all funnel towards a strip of some kind with casinos in them. And this is a city that, rather than radiating out from a point of focus, are the streets all lead up to these long strips that act as funnels. So this is a city that is designed to consume the inhabitants in a certain way, because right, the streets are designed to literally funnel people into the casinos. It's like almost like using a funnel to jam food into the city's gullet. You can think of it like that. So, the what else can I say about the right of the builders? I talk a little bit about their city planning, because I think the way that they transform a space, I'm talking about sort of the traditional right, the builders, the pioneers, the people who build up a civilization, the fathers of a civilization. I talk about the way that people build cities, because I think the way that people build cities and build towns is very helpful in understanding how they view the world in general. So what we can take away from an understanding of the builders, just from city architecture, for example, is that they understand that the fundamental level, I would say, of human civilization is the village. That good cities function as sort of connected villages, such as in New York, the example of all the different ethnic neighborhoods. And they also understand that, or in contrast, newer ways of understanding how to build a city. They have these grids for efficiency, and in the case of something like Las Vegas, the way that the cities are laid up, sort of cover an antinomian spirit, a spirit of consumption, a spirit of decadence. I think this general principle of the builder pronomians being able to, order a society in a correct way, order a society with a particular kind of center, is also not, merely reducible to the way they laid out their cities. I take, for example, the way they lay out their churches. If you've ever seen a traditional Gothic cross style church, of course, the whole church is set up in such a way that the altar is the summit and the pinnacle of the church. And similarly, in their political structures, of course, you have the monarch, the king and the queen, who reign over a country much like a father and a mother. And they replicate these different structures of meaning, specifically family structures of meaning, throughout their political systems, right? And so I think what we could say about the builder pronomians is that they have a concept of ordering. They have a concept of understanding patterns in nature and how they relate to how human beings are supposed to interact with the world. And then they put those patterns into their society, and they make their society reflect those natural patterns, uh, patterns that lead to healthy and ordered, functioning societies. So this right of the builders, as I'm calling it, is, I think, by far the more dynamic of the two modes of pronomism or pronomianism. And its energy is the strongest at the beginning of a civilization's power or directly thereafter. And it reaches a critical mass just before the civilization reaches its apex. After that, the society seems to, in general, of course, we're talking in very general terms, but after that, the energy of the society seems to turn antinomian, right? When a society is well ordered, it brings about stability and plenty, and that stability and plenty brings about this antinomian, anti-traditional, chaotic way of relating to the societal structure. And all that pronomian energy is concentrated in a group of people that I call the preservers. So after a period of decadence, or when a period of decadence begins, the torch of pronomianism will be passed on to these preserver people. And these people, you can think of them as they're reactionary people. They have an emotional and spiritual attachment to the projects of their fathers, even though sometimes that attachment can be muddled and confused. The problem being that they don't have any of the dynamism that their fathers had, and they often have no good idea of where to take the society. Very often they're clinging with bated breath to the breastworks of what their fathers built, and they're kind of hoping that it holds together. They're in a much harder battle than the builders, than their fathers, their forefathers, because what they're fighting is the accumulated and ever snowballing effect of social entropy. And I think it's also difficult because they're fighting an enemy that's highly amorphous. It's highly mobile. Of course, we're talking about the forces of social entropy, so this can take millions of different shapes and forms. We're talking about a society's natural inclination to degenerate. And so often what this does is it breeds it causes these people to embrace a kind of violence. I would say especially a kind of violence that is sexual. It's like almost violently sexual. It's very, in my mind, it feels a lot like a husband trying to subdue an unfaithful wife. And it often leads to atrocities that are born out of madness and desperation. There's a kind of mind that craves order and can't make sense of chaos, can't live beside it. It's rigid and intolerant. There's a kind of psychosis that comes about. Not all people are like this, but on the extremes of this particular kind of ideology, you'll have these people who are very, very purist in their understanding of the world. So whereas the builder subdues chaos through largely constructive, if not peaceful means, the preserver often does so through violence, particularly extreme violence, justified or otherwise. They also tend to embrace mythology to replace what they can no longer understand from their fathers. A good example of this, I'm going to use this example and contrast it with a different example, is the Third Reich. They were very interested in sort of a neo-pagan, a Volkish mythology for the German people, because it was very hard for them to recover, I think, the sort of traditional mode of what made Germany a strong, what made it a builder nation, the traditions of the builders that made Germany essentially. So they we've talked about mythology and them not being able to understand their fathers. They also lack, in a sense, an ability to create and sustain what is true. So they cling to what is conveniently false, hoping to make it true. I think, there's a lot of good examples of this, but the specific example I'm using is in Nazi Germany, this whole project of building a mythological history for the German people. So this makes this whole concept of they have these violent tendencies because they're in a position that's extremely frustrating, and they're fighting an enemy that they don't really understand. It's very hard to get their arms around, and they also embrace this mythological structure. Um, this makes the preservers, especially in societies that are in an advanced state of decay, highly dangerous and highly volatile. It's no secret here, right, that I'm speaking about fascist movements. And in the 20th century, there's really two discernible approaches. Um, so the Nazis were hyper violent, they were hyper mythological, and they were embracing the dynamism of the Hegelian model that birthed their chief adversaries, the communists, and they were attempting to sort of ride the tiger to subdue the agents of chaos. They were sort of, I think, seduced by this promise of being able to impose order on a extremely chaotic, disordered political and social situation, which was post-war Germany and post-war Europe, by embracing this awesome destructive power of absolute violence, like had been demonstrated in the First World War. And so, in the end of all of this, with their proximity to violence and untruth coupled together, I think this is one of the chief reasons why their movement descended into madness, as typified by the final solution. The final solution was not a good military tactic. It wasn't a good scare tactic either. It was really just a senseless act of brutality committed by a collection of men that were alienated from everything that was true, and they were lashing out in the dark of sort of a calmly approaching night. Um, and so I want you to contrast the Nazis with Francoism. So while brutal, like every regime in the 20th century, free or unfree, democratic or autocratic, they drew on the well springs of traditional Spanish culture, monarchism, the church, and as a result, I would say they did not descend into the kind of catalytic barbarism and violence that ended up sweeping up the Third Reich. Um, it didn't survive, obviously. Franco died, and they transitioned over to what we would consider now to be a liberal democracy. But it did keep the Spanish people from sort of descending into the depths of madness like the Germans did during the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century. So, given taking that all in mind, what mode are we going to choose? So, as has been borne out by my two chief examples of preserver pronomianism, so Nazi Germany and Franco's Spain, the best laid plans of the preservers will never overcome social entropy, in my opinion. The devil is at all times working for the unraveling of all things. If you don't want to say the devil's doing it, you can say whatever. Forces of social entropy, the tendency towards chaos, whatever you'd like to call it, are always trying to unravel things. And these forces especially like to whisper in the ears of people who think that they are the tie that binds. The builder looks out on the chaos and sees a wilderness. They see a landscape that can and should be subdued and ordered to human ends. So the slings and arrows of our current political moment could be treated as an encroaching darkness, like a preserver mentality would say. Or it could be treated as wild animals to be fenced in, rivers to be forded, and forests to be sawn into timbers and used to build a new societal structure. I think the story that best typifies the builder mentality, and I'm probably going to do a longer story on this particular topic, or sorry, I'm going to do a longer video about this particular topic, but it's Canticle for Leibowitz. If you've ever read this novel, it's about an abbey of monks, and they're building up the abbey as this perpetual place of refuge uh, in thousands of years of history, of cataclysmic war, of long eras of dark ages, of scientific revolutions, and then of war again. So I think, and I'm not, like I said, I'm going to do a longer video on Canticle for Leibowitz, but I think that sort of model, that sort of building and maintaining model is what we sort of are looking for. Because if you'll notice, I would say in A Canticle for Leibowitz, it's not so much that they build the abbey and then preserve it, and subsequent generations act as a preserving force, but rather the abbey is always, in a sense, in a process of building, which I think that's sort of the tendency that I would like to foster in people on the right, is that we always need to be in a state of building. In a sense, we need to be on the offensive, because when we play the defensive, we lose. Entropy is not on our side. Um, so, given that, even when you're in this preserver mindset, when you're in this calling out the SJWs mindset, your keyboard warrioring, or even going out in the street and participating in some of these dumb brawls like people do, that's pleasurable. It's orgasmic. To be in that preserver mode, striking out against the forces of social entropy. You're notching your belts, you're getting bloody, and you're struggling. Um, but ultimately, that's not very productive, I think. And that's why I would suggest we adopt the builder mentality. Does that mean throwing away everything that we already have and starting fresh? No, I don't think so. I don't think such a thing even makes sense, because I don't think in all the history of the building and rebuilding of civilizations, ever there were certainly things new under the sun, don't get me wrong, but there's always a sense that what is there is being built on what came before. It couldn't be any other way. So when we pick up our brushes and our canvas, and we are going to paint the next picture, paint the next society, and we look down at our palette, we're going to find that the colors that we have mixed for us, they were mixed for us by our fathers beforehand. So those are my thoughts on the two different modes, I feel, of right wing organization, and how the right wing sort of relates to the world, whether it's by building or by preserving against entropy. And this is why I've decided that we need to be emphasizing a builder mentality instead of a preserver mentality. But anyway, guys, that's been the Hidebound Convivium for October 7th. Enjoy, and God bless.